5:33 a.m., October 23, 1944. The ocean was still dark when the first torpedo left the tube. No warning, no declaration, no second chance. 6 steel cylinders accelerated through black water at 46 knots, and in the next 21 minutes, the largest naval operation Japan ever attempted began dying before it fired a single shot in return. 12,500 Japanese sailors dead. 4 aircraft carriers gone. 3 battleships destroyed. An empire that had ruled the Pacific for 3 years finished. All of it traced back to 2 American submarines, 6 torpedoes, and a commander nobody in Washington had ever heard of. His name was David McClintock. Not an admiral, not a decorated war hero plastered across magazine covers back home. Just a submarine commander from a small town running a boat with a crew of 80 men through waters the Japanese called their own. And on the morning of October 23, 1944, he made a decision so dangerous that his own crew thought he had lost his mind. A decision that would detonate a chain reaction of confusion, hesitation, and psychological collapse stretching across 4 days and 400 miles of ocean. But before we get to what McClintock did, you need to understand what was at stake and why Japan was betting everything on a single throw of the dice. By October 1944, the Japanese Empire was hemorrhaging from every direction. Saipan had fallen. Guam had fallen. Tinian had fallen. Every island lost pushed American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. But the real disaster was happening beneath the surface of the Pacific, where American submarines had turned Japan's shipping lanes into graveyards. Oil tankers vanished weekly. Cargo convoys disappeared without warning. Fuel shortages became so catastrophic that portions of the Imperial Navy sat anchored at their docks, unable to move because there was simply nothing left to put in their engines. Tokyo understood what this meant. Without fuel, without supply lines, without the Philippines as a strategic buffer, Japan would slowly strangle to death from within. American industrial production was replacing every ship, every aircraft, every weapon lost in combat, faster than Japanese factories could dream of matching. The math was becoming impossible to deny, so Japanese leadership made a decision. One final massive counterattack. One decisive battle that could reverse the entire trajectory of the war. They called it Operation Shogo, Victory Operation. The plan was brutally simple in concept and nightmarishly complex in execution. 3 separate Japanese fleets would converge on the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines from different directions simultaneously. A 4th fleet of aircraft carriers would act as bait, luring Admiral Halsey and his powerful carrier groups away from the beaches where American troops were landing. Then, with Halsey gone, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would smash through the unprotected landing area, destroying transport supply ships and thousands of soldiers still unloading onto exposed beaches. If it worked, the catastrophic American losses might force Washington into negotiations. If it worked, Japan might survive. At the center of everything was Kurita himself. A veteran commander with decades of experience, aggressive by temperament, respected by his fleet. His center force was the most powerful surface armada Japan still possessed. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers, including Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest battleships ever constructed by any nation in the history of naval warfare. Ships so enormous their main guns could throw shells weighing 3,000 pounds across a distance of 25 miles. On paper, nothing the Americans had positioned near Leyte could stop them. But to reach Leyte Gulf, Kurita's armada had to pass through Palawan Passage, a narrow stretch of water. American submariners had quietly nicknamed Submarine Alley. Deep channels forced large surface fleets into predictable corridors, while reefs along the edges eliminated any room for emergency maneuvering. It was, in military terms, an almost ideal killing ground. Kurita knew the danger. He chose speed over caution, pressing forward before American reconnaissance could confirm his position and trigger a full response. What Kurita did not know was that he was already too late. The night before his fleet entered Palawan Passage, radar operators aboard USS Darter picked up a contact. Then another. Then 10 more. Then dozens. Commander David McClintock stared at the radar screen and felt something cold move through him. This was not a convoy. This was an armada, the largest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining anywhere in the Pacific, moving directly toward his position. He grabbed the radio and transmitted immediately to USS Dace, a second American submarine running nearby. Multiple contacts. You need to see this. Within minutes, both submarines had confirmed what the radar was showing. The entire center force, every battleship, every cruiser, every destroyer was moving through water where 2 American submarines were quietly waiting. But there was a problem. A massive one. Kurita's fleet was moving at speed. To reach a firing position before sunrise, before the Japanese fleet passed beyond range entirely, both submarines would have to surface and sprint ahead through open water at maximum speed. Fully exposed. Fully visible to any Japanese lookout or radar operator scanning the darkness. One detection meant destroyers' depth charges and the end of the entire operation before it began. Every officer aboard USS Darter understood what surfacing meant. You did not challenge a fleet of this size on the surface in a submarine. You simply did not do it. The mathematics of survival ran entirely in the wrong direction. McClintock ordered it anyway. Surface. Full speed ahead. Diesel engines thundered alive. Both submarines cut through black water at 21 knots, racing to get ahead of the Japanese formation before dawn stripped away the darkness protecting them. For nearly 2 hours, the submarines ran flat out, while the massive Japanese fleet moved parallel through the night, neither side aware exactly how close they were to each other. Then, with minutes to spare before the first gray light appeared on the horizon, both USS Darter and USS Dace reached firing position. Engines shut down. The submarines slipped silently beneath the surface. Red emergency lighting replaced white. Voices dropped to whispers. Every man aboard understood that the next few minutes would either change the war or end their lives. Through the periscope, McClintock watched the Japanese formation materialize out of darkness. Destroyers first churning through the water in forward screen. Then cruisers massive and purposeful. Then the battleships, shapes so enormous they seemed to blot out the horizon behind them. And then directly in the center of the formation, leading everything, the heavy cruiser Atago. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's flagship. Less than 1,000 yards away, McClintock steadied himself. Every calculation was already made. Distance, speed, angle. The torpedo spread was set. Nothing remained except the order. He gave it. Fire. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo surged out of the tube and accelerated into darkness. Then the second. Then 4 more in rapid sequence. 6 torpedoes racing toward the flagship of Japan's final offensive. Inside the submarine, everyone stared at their stopwatches. Nobody spoke. The seconds stretched into something unbearable. Then the ocean itself seemed to explode. The first torpedo detonated against Atago's starboard side beneath the bridge, tearing through steel plating and destroying 2 boiler rooms instantly. Steam and fire erupted skyward. A second torpedo struck further aft, and the flagship shuddered so violently that men were thrown from their feet across every deck. Lights failed. Smoke poured through passageways. Phones went dead. Damage control teams rushed into darkness trying to stop flooding that was already beyond stopping. Half a mile away, USS Dace sent its own spread into the heavy cruiser Maya. Multiple hits. Maya began sinking almost immediately. Back aboard Atago, the list to starboard was increasing by the minute. Experienced sailors did not need an officer to tell them what it meant. The flagship was dying. Vice Admiral Kurita himself climbed through a shattered window and dropped into the sea as the ship collapsed around him. The commander of Japan's most powerful fleet, the man upon whom the entire fate of Operation Shogo rested, floated in burning oil while hundreds of his sailors disappeared beneath the surface around him screaming. At 5:54 a.m., exactly 21 minutes after the attack began, Atago rolled completely onto her side, propellers rising briefly above the waterline, then slid beneath the Pacific forever. More than 360 men went with her. 2 American submarines had just ripped the command structure out of Japan's final great offensive, and the battle for Leyte Gulf had not even officially started yet. But here is what the history books rarely tell you. The physical destruction, 2 cruisers sunk 300 men dead, was almost secondary, because Kurita survived. He was pulled from the burning water, transferred to Yamato, and ordered to continue the advance. On paper, his fleet remained powerful enough to complete the mission. The battleships were intact. The destroyers were intact. The plan was intact. What was not intact was something far more important. And in Part 2, you will see exactly what happens when the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever assembled, commanded by an admiral psychologically broken before the real battle begins, sails directly toward the moment that will determine the fate of an empire. Kurita survived. That was the problem. 2 American submarines had just torn the command structure out of Japan's final naval offensive. The flagship Atago was gone. The cruiser, Maya, was gone. More than 360 men had disappeared beneath Palawan Passage in 21 minutes. And yet the man responsible for commanding the entire operation had been pulled from burning oil, transferred to the battleship Yamato, and ordered to continue advancing toward Leyte Gulf. On paper, the center force was still the most powerful surface fleet Japan possessed. 4 battleships remained, 8 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers, enough firepower to destroy every American transport sitting off the beaches of Leyte. The mission was technically still achievable, but Kurita was no longer the same commander who had departed Brunei 2 days earlier, and the Americans were not finished with him yet. When Kurita climbed aboard, Yamato wrapped in borrowed clothing smelling of burning oil, the officers around him noticed something immediately. He was quiet. Not the disciplined quiet of a commander conserving energy before a critical engagement. Something else. Witnesses later described a man moving through the motions of command, while something essential had gone dark inside him. He answered questions, he reviewed charts, he issued orders. But the aggressive certainty that had defined his command style throughout the war was absent, replaced by something slower, more hesitant, more fragile. Nobody said it directly. You did not say such things aboard a Japanese warship in 1944. But everyone sensed it. The fleet reorganized and pressed forward into the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th. And that was when the Americans hit them again. This time from the air. Admiral Halsey's carrier groups had received McClintock's contact report hours earlier. By dawn, reconnaissance aircraft were already tracking Kurita's formation across the Philippine Sea. When they confirmed the fleet's position and composition, Halsey did not hesitate. He launched everything. Wave after wave of American aircraft descended onto the Japanese formation. Hellcat fighters tore apart the defensive screen. Helldiver bombers pushed through anti-aircraft fire in near-vertical attack runs. Avenger torpedo planes approached low and fast from multiple directions, simultaneously forcing Japanese gunners to choose between targets they could not all track at once. The sky above the Sibuyan Sea filled with black smoke, exploding shells, and the constant sound of engines that never seemed to stop coming. At the center of the assault stood Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. Her designers had armored her specifically to survive this kind of punishment. Her anti-aircraft batteries were among the most extensive ever fitted to a surface warship. She was by every conventional measure nearly unsinkable. American aviators hit her anyway, again and again and again. The first waves scored bomb hits across her forward decks. The torpedo planes followed, striking below the waterline, where armor was thinner and flooding was harder to control. Damage control teams worked frantically through smoke-filled compartments, trying to seal bulkheads and manage the rising water. For a time it seemed to be working. Musashi slowed but continued forward. Her guns kept firing. Then the second wave arrived. Then the third. By early afternoon, Musashi had absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 direct bomb strikes. Her speed had dropped to 6 knots. Flooding was spreading through her lower compartments faster than any crew could address. Her massive hull was listing badly to port. Officers ordered the flooding of starboard compartments to correct the list, but the maneuver only delayed the inevitable. At 7:35 p.m. Musashi rolled onto her side and sank, taking 1,023 men to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita watched it from Yamato's bridge. He had now lost his flagship, multiple cruisers, and one of the 2 greatest battleships in naval history, all before reaching the actual objective. He sent a message to Tokyo requesting permission to temporarily reverse course and wait for air cover. The request was denied. Advance, no matter the cost. He obeyed. But the message traffic between Yamato and Tokyo was becoming slower, more uncertain, filled with requests for clarification that would have been unnecessary from the Kurita who had sailed from Brunei. Command confidence does not disappear all at once. It erodes. And by the evening of October 24th, the erosion was becoming visible to anyone watching closely enough. That night, the center force passed through San Bernardino Strait in darkness. American submarines and aircraft had reported the fleet's movements throughout the day, but a critical communications failure meant Admiral Halsey believed Kurita had retreated. Halsey had already turned north with his powerful carrier groups to attack the Japanese decoy fleet under Admiral Ozawa. San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. Kurita sailed through without opposition. At dawn on October 25th, lookouts aboard Yamato spotted shapes on the horizon, small, low in the water, moving south at moderate speed. For a moment, Japanese observers assumed they were looking at destroyers. Then the silhouettes resolved into something else entirely. Escort carriers. Small, slow, lightly armored ships designed for anti-submarine patrol and troop support. Not combat vessels. Not warships built to fight battleships. Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, roughly 7,500 men, standing between Kurita's armada and the most vulnerable American forces in the entire Pacific theater. Some Japanese officers initially believed they had found part of Halsey's main carrier force. Then the truth became clear. These were the smallest warships the Americans had anywhere near Leyte. Their maximum speed was 18 knots. Kurita's cruisers could do 32. His battleships could manage 27. His guns outranged theirs by miles. His shells outweighed theirs by thousands of pounds per volley. At 6:58 a.m., the center force opened fire. Giant colored shell splashes erupted around the American escort carriers as Japanese battleships found their range. Each ship had been assigned a different dye color for its shells to help gunners track their own fire during a mass engagement. Red, yellow, green, purple. The ocean around Taffy 3 turned into something that looked almost abstract. Enormous columns of colored water rising and falling around ships that had no right to survive the next 10 minutes. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, understood immediately what was happening. He had no good options. Running was impossible. His carriers could not outrun Japanese cruisers. Fighting conventionally was suicide. His destroyers carried 5-inch guns against vessels armed with 8-inch and 18-inch weapons. Every calculation pointed toward total annihilation within the hour. So Sprague chose something else. He chose chaos. Every aircraft aboard every escort carrier launched immediately carrying whatever weapons were available. Some aircraft lifted off with anti-submarine depth charges because there were no bombs left. Others carried almost no ordnance at all. It did not matter. Aircraft in the air forced Japanese gunners to split their attention. Aircraft attacking from multiple directions forced Japanese ships to maneuver. Maneuvering ships were harder to coordinate. Harder to coordinate fleets made worse decisions. Then Sprague ordered his destroyers forward. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston did not wait for clarification. He pushed his ship to flank speed and turned directly toward the Japanese heavy cruisers at the front of the formation. Johnston displaced 2,100 tons. The cruisers she was charging displaced between 13,000 and 15,000. Her 5-inch guns were toys against their 8-inch batteries. Evans knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards and fired every torpedo she carried. Then she fired her deck guns continuously while Japanese shells began hitting her hull. She absorbed a direct hit from a cruiser salvo that destroyed her engine room and knocked out her rear guns. She kept firing with what remained. She turned back toward the Japanese formation for a second attack run. She was eventually hit by so many shells that she stopped moving entirely still afloat. Still firing one gun as Japanese destroyers circled around her. Johnston sank at 10:10 a.m. Evans went down with her. He was 27 years old. USS Hoel charged the Japanese battleship line and launched torpedoes at ranges so close that survival was effectively impossible. She was struck by 40 shells before sinking. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, less than half the size of a conventional destroyer, attacked so aggressively that Japanese observers filed post-battle reports describing her as a heavy cruiser. She was torn apart by gunfire, but kept her guns firing until the ship physically could not stay afloat. And throughout all of it, American aircraft kept attacking. Pilots who had already expended every weapon made additional attack runs anyway, diving toward Japanese ships to force evasive maneuvers, to break formation, cohesion to buy seconds that might keep the escort carriers alive a few minutes longer. Some made 10 consecutive attack runs with empty weapons bays. The goal was not to destroy. The goal was to confuse. It worked. Inside Yamato's bridge, reports were arriving faster than anyone could process them. Cruisers damaged. Destroyers separated. Torpedo tracks in the water from directions that made no tactical sense. Aircraft attacking continuously despite being shot down in large numbers. American ships charging directly into point-blank gunfire instead of retreating. The battle had stopped making sense according to any doctrine Kurita had ever studied. Then the psychological weight of the previous 48 hours descended completely. At 9:20 a.m., with the American escort carriers still visible and burning, and the transports of Leyte Gulf theoretically only hours away, Kurita issued the order that ended Japan's last realistic chance to change the outcome of the Pacific War. Turn north. Regroup. Withdraw. His own staff fell silent when they heard it. Some officers later described the moment as feeling physically wrong, like gravity had reversed inside the operations room. Ahead of them lay everything Operation Shogo had been designed to destroy: vulnerable transports, ammunition ships, fuel vessels, thousands of soldiers still on beaches without cover. One concentrated push and the American invasion of the Philippines could have been set back by months. Kurita turned away from it. The order stood. The center force came about and began moving north, away from Leyte, away from the transports, away from the entire objective of the operation. And as the Japanese fleet withdrew, the American escort carriers that should have been burning wrecks on the ocean floor were still afloat, still launching aircraft, still transmitting position reports to every American command within range. Somewhere beneath the waters of Palawan Passage, the wreck of Otago had already begun its long silence. But the damage she carried with her when she sank was not finished yet. Because while Kurita retreated north, the rest of Operation Shogo was finishing its own collapse in two separate stretches of water. And what happened there would remove any remaining doubt about what Leyte Gulf actually meant for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The full story of what those other fleets encountered is coming in Part 3. And it is worse than anything Kurita experienced. Kurita turned north. The transport survived, and the largest naval battle in history was not over yet. While the center force retreated from Samar, two other Japanese fleets were completing their own destruction in separate stretches of water. Operation Shogo had promised a synchronized three-directional assault that would overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous pressure. What it delivered instead was three separate catastrophes happening within hours of each other, each one confirming what the sinking of Otago had already suggested. Japan had lost the ability to control the outcome of this war at sea. The numbers arriving in Tokyo on October 25th were incomprehensible. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships destroyed, 10 cruisers gone, 11 destroyers lost, more than 12,500 sailors dead. And the American invasion of the Philippines, the target of the entire operation, remained completely intact. Now the question was not whether Japan could win at Leyte Gulf. The question was whether anyone in Tokyo could admit what it actually meant. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura never made it out of Surigao Strait. His southern force had entered the strait on the night of October 24th, carrying 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers. His assignment was simple: drive north through Surigao Strait, emerge at the far end, and link up with Kurita's center force for the final assault on Leyte Gulf. The plan assumed he would encounter light resistance. American forces were supposed to be fully occupied dealing with Kurita from the north, and Ozawa's carriers from the northeast. What Nishimura found instead was Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line waiting across the top of the strait in the dark. Oldendorf had arranged his forces with textbook precision, a deployment so effective that naval historians still study it today. 39 PT boats patrolled the southern approaches, harassing Nishimura's formation from the moment it entered the strait. Then, 28 destroyers waited in the middle sections, positioned for coordinated torpedo attacks against both flanks simultaneously. And at the top of the strait, 6 American battleships stretched across the full width of the water, in a line their guns trained south. 5 of those 6 battleships had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. They had been raised, repaired, and sent back to the Pacific specifically for moments like this one. Nishimura pressed forward anyway. His orders had not changed. The PT boats struck first, firing torpedoes from multiple directions and forcing the Japanese formation to maneuver repeatedly through the darkness. No ships sank, but the constant pressure slowed the column and disrupted formation discipline. Then the American destroyers attacked from both sides, simultaneously launching 47 torpedoes in coordinated spreads that gave Japanese gunners no single direction to engage. Fuso took 2 torpedo hits. Her magazines detonated. The battleship split completely in half. Both sections continued burning on the surface for nearly an hour, before sinking separately, creating the surreal image of 2 distinct fires where one ship had been moments before. More than 1,600 men died with her. Nishimura's flagship Yamashiro absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits, but continued forward into the northern section of the strait. Damaged. Flooding. Still moving. Then Oldendorf's battleships opened fire. The range was under 20,000 yards. Radar-directed fire control gave American gunners accuracy impossible to achieve in daylight by conventional methods. Shell after shell found Yamashiro in the darkness. The battleship began burning from stem to stern, her speed dropping, her guns still attempting to return fire against targets she could barely locate. Nishimura was killed on the bridge. Yamashiro finally capsized at 4:19 a.m., taking nearly her entire crew with her. The southern force had been destroyed in less than 2 hours. Only one destroyer escaped Surigao Strait alive. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in the history of naval warfare, and it was not close. Far to the north, Admiral Ozawa's decoy force was completing its own sacrifice. The plan had actually worked in one narrow sense. Halsey had taken the bait. His powerful Task Force 34 had raced north through the night, chasing Ozawa's carriers, exactly as Japanese planners had intended. By dawn on October 25th, American carrier aircraft were overwhelming Ozawa's formation from every direction. But the sacrifice produced nothing. Kurita had already retreated from Samar before Halsey could be recalled to cover the strait. The decoy worked tactically and failed strategically because the fleet it was designed to protect had already abandoned the mission. One by one, Ozawa's carriers went down. Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuiho, and then Zuikaku, the last surviving Japanese fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, the ship that had launched aircraft over Hawaii on December 7, 1941. Zuikaku's crew lowered her battle flag and transferred it to a destroyer as she listed beyond recovery. Survivors described grown men weeping openly on her decks as she went under. 4 Japanese carriers sunk in a single day. The Imperial Navy's offensive air power was gone. When the complete picture of Leyte Gulf assembled itself across American intelligence desks in the days following the battle, the analysts struggled to find historical comparisons adequate for what had just happened. In 4 days of fighting across an area of ocean larger than France, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 300 aircraft, and 12,500 men. American losses were significant, but recoverable. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, roughly 3,000 men. The ratio was simply not survivable for an empire already running on diminishing resources. Japanese naval commanders returning from Leyte Gulf faced something harder than defeat. They faced the end of a strategic concept that had defined the Imperial Navy for 2 decades. The decisive fleet battle, the grand engagement where Japanese skill and sacrifice would overcome American industrial superiority, had finally happened. It had happened at Leyte Gulf. And Japan had lost it so completely that the concept itself died with the ships on the ocean floor. Admiral Suemu Toyota, who had ordered Operation Shogo from shore, later stated that after Leyte Gulf, he understood the surface navy could no longer meaningfully influence the war's outcome. What he could not yet admit publicly was what that understanding actually implied. If the surface navy was finished, if conventional air power was exhausted, if submarines were being hunted down in increasing numbers, then the only weapons Japan had remaining were the ones that relied on individual human sacrifice rather than industrial capacity. The weapons that asked young men to die deliberately rather than fight and possibly survive. The first organized kamikaze attacks had already begun during the Battle of Leyte Gulf itself. On October 25th, the same morning, Taffy 3 was fighting for survival off Samar. A small group of Zero fighters dove deliberately into American escort carriers nearby. USS St. Lo was struck and sank within an hour. The first American warship sunk by a deliberate kamikaze attack. The tactic produced immediate results that conventional air attack could no longer achieve. And Japanese planners noticed. Within weeks, kamikaze operations would expand from isolated actions into a systematic program, consuming hundreds of pilots and thousands of hours of remaining fuel. It was not a strategy designed to win. It was a strategy designed to make winning cost more than the Americans were willing to pay. The mathematics of the decisive fleet battle had been replaced by the mathematics of acceptable casualties. Kurita survived the war and lived until 1977. He never fully explained his decision to withdraw at Samar, giving different accounts at different times, none of them completely satisfying to the historians who pressed him. Some who knew him believed the sinking of Otago had damaged something fundamental in his psychology that no subsequent events could fully repair. Others argued he made a rational assessment of an impossible situation, and history judged him harshly for refusing to spend his remaining ships on an attack he no longer believed could succeed. Both explanations may be true simultaneously. What remained undeniable was the chain of events McClintock's torpedoes had set in motion. 2 submarines, 3 destroyers, 4 escort carriers, 5 battleships, 6 cruisers, 7 destroyers, 8 escort carriers, 9 destroyers, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 12,500 men. 6 torpedoes. 21 minutes. The destruction of one cruiser and the psychological disorientation of one admiral had cascaded through 4 days and 4 separate engagements until an entire empire's naval strategy lay broken across the floor of the Pacific. The man who pulled the trigger was never famous. David McClintock received appropriate decorations and continued serving through the end of the war. USS Darter ran aground on Bombay Shoal shortly after the Palawan attack and had to be abandoned. Her crew rescued by USS Dace before the submarine was destroyed to prevent capture. McClintock survived. He spent the rest of his career in relative obscurity. The wreck of Otago still lies at the bottom of Palawan Passage. The wreck of Musashi was located in 2015 by a research team funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, resting at a depth of nearly 3,300 feet. Yamashiro and Fuso remain in Surigao Strait. Zuikaku rests somewhere beneath the Philippine Sea. They are graves, and they mark the coordinates where one of history's most powerful naval forces stopped being a threat to anyone. But there is one final chapter to this story that almost nobody tells. What happened after Leyte Gulf in the months between the battle and the end of the war reveals something about the nature of military collapse that goes beyond ships and casualty figures. And it involves decisions made in Tokyo that still provoke debate among historians today. That story is in part 4. And it is the part that explains why Leyte Gulf matters beyond the Pacific War itself. The fleet was gone. The battle was over. But the story was not finished. In 4 days of fighting across the waters surrounding the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a meaningful offensive force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 12,500 men, all of it gone. And yet the question that historians would spend the next 8 decades debating was never really about the ships or the casualty figures. It was about the 21 minutes at Palawan Passage, and the single commander who surfaced his submarine into open water against every instinct of survival to chase the largest Japanese fleet remaining in the Pacific. What happened to David McClintock after the war ended, almost nobody knows. That is exactly the point. McClintock returned home without a parade, without a monument, without the kind of recognition that attaches itself to names like Halsey or Nimitz or Spruance admirals who commanded fleets and appeared in newspaper photographs and gave speeches that history preserved. McClintock commanded a submarine. His greatest action lasted less than half an hour. The ship he became famous for, USS Darter, had run aground on Bombay Shoal immediately after the Palawan attack and been abandoned on the reef, destroyed by her own crew to prevent capture. He finished the war aboard other vessels decorated appropriately promoted through the standard channels, and eventually retired into the quiet obscurity that consumed most men who had done extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, and then outlived the circumstances entirely. He died in 1997. Most of the obituaries that mentioned him at all got the details slightly wrong. The men who had served beneath him remembered differently. Sailors who had been aboard Darter during the Palawan attack described the decision to surface and sprint ahead of a Japanese armada as the most terrifying and simultaneously most clarifying moment of their lives. One crew member interviewed decades later said simply that McClintock never explained his reasoning out loud. He just gave the order and expected it to be followed. And it was. Because the men who served under commanders like that followed not out of obligation, but out of something closer to faith, the belief that the man giving the order had already calculated everything you were too frightened to think through yourself. Ernest Evans, who commanded USS Johnston and charged his destroyer directly into the Japanese battleship line off Samar, was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His citation described actions so far beyond conventional expectation that the review board apparently struggled to find adequate language. Evans had been born in Oklahoma to a Cherokee father. He had told his crew when he assumed command that he intended to fight the ship until she sank or the war ended, whichever came first. The ship sank. Evans went with her. He was 27 years old. The crew of USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that Japanese observers mistook for a heavy cruiser, received a unit citation that their commanding officer never read. He had been killed during the battle. Most of his crew survived by clinging to wreckage in shark-infested water for nearly 50 hours before rescue aircraft found them. Several did not survive the wait. These were not famous men. They were welders and machinists and farmers who had put on uniforms and learned their jobs and done things that the uniform required of them. Things that no amount of training truly prepares a person to do. And when it was over, most of them went home and said very little about it for the rest of their lives, which is its own kind of statement about what they had seen. The lessons embedded in Leyte Gulf are not primarily technical, though the technical lessons were real and lasting. American submarine doctrine was validated so completely by the Pacific War that it shaped underwater warfare strategy for the next 50 years. The ability to strike command structures before the main engagement begins to create psychological disruption that compounds physical damage became a foundational principle of modern naval planning. Every subsequent generation of submarine commanders studied Palawan Passage. Some of them are still studying it. The kamikaze program that expanded dramatically after Leyte Gulf represents a darker lesson, one about what happens when conventional military capacity is exhausted and leadership cannot accept the strategic reality in front of them. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in deliberate attacks against American fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. The discovery generated significant media attention and confirmed details about the battleship's final hours that survivor accounts had left ambiguous. But what the expedition also documented, almost as an aside in the technical reports, was the remarkable preservation state of the wreck itself. Musashi's main gun turrets remained largely intact. Her superstructure was recognizable. Artifacts from daily life aboard the ship, dishes, tools, personal effects were visible in the silt around the hull. She had been the largest battleship in the world when she sank. She remained in her way, enormous, even in her grave. What the expedition could not document was something that no remotely operated vehicle can measure. The Sibuyan Sea, where Musashi rests. The Palawan Passage, where Atago lies the Surigao Strait, where Yamashiro and Fuso went down. These are not simply coordinates in navigational charts. They are the locations where a particular vision of warfare, built over decades by an empire that genuinely believed technological superiority and warrior spirit could substitute for industrial capacity, finally encountered the limits of that belief. The decisive fleet battle happened. Japan lost it so thoroughly that the concept itself became a historical artifact. And the cascade began. Most historians now agree not at Samar, where Taffy 3 fought its impossible action. Not at Surigao Strait, where 6 resurrected American battleships completed their own kind of symmetry with Pearl Harbor, not even during the air attacks on Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea. It began at 5:33 in the morning on October 23, 1944, when a submarine commander from a small American town decided that surfacing his boat in front of an enemy armada was the correct decision, gave the order without lengthy explanation, and then drove his vessel at maximum speed through darkness toward a firing position that made the difference between everything and nothing. 2 submarines, 6 torpedoes, 21 minutes. From that single action in waters nobody had considered particularly significant before that morning, a chain reaction propagated across 4 days and 400 miles of ocean until 12,500 Japanese sailors were dead. 4 aircraft carriers were on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, and the Imperial Japanese Navy existed only as surviving hulls that fuel shortages would increasingly prevent from moving. The ocean remembers what the history books American vessels. They sank 34 ships and damaged nearly 400 more. They killed roughly 4,900 American sailors. The numbers are significant. They were not significant enough to alter the outcome of the war, which Japanese military leadership understood and continued the program anyway. That decision to spend young men's lives on attacks that could wound but not stop, the American advance, represents perhaps the most important lesson Leyte Gulf teaches about the relationship between institutional culture and strategic thinking. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around a concept, the decisive fleet battle, that assumed Japanese tactical excellence could overcome American industrial superiority in a single climactic engagement. When that concept failed at Leyte Gulf, the institution had no alternative framework to replace it. So it defaulted to sacrifice, because sacrifice was the one resource Japan still possessed in quantities that production could not exhaust. American military institutions made their own catastrophic errors throughout the Pacific War. The failure to properly arm the Mark 14 torpedo cost American submarines 2 years of effectiveness. They never fully recovered. The decision to divide the fleet at Leyte Gulf in ways that left San Bernardino Strait unguarded nearly produced a disaster that would have set the Philippine campaign back by months. Halsey's pursuit of Ozawa's decoys, while tactically understandable, left Taffy 3 facing odds that should have been unsurvivable. What saved Taffy 3 was not superior equipment or strategic brilliance, It was the decision made by individual commanders, Evans on Johnston Howell's Captain Roberts's captain, to attack forces they could not defeat in order to protect forces that could not protect themselves. That decision was not in any manual. It emerged from character, from the specific combination of training and temperament and circumstance that produces actions no institution can fully plan for or replicate. Now for the detail that most accounts of Leyte Gulf leave out entirely. In 2015, Paul Allen's research vessel located the wreck of Musashi at a depth of 3,280 press into statistics. It holds the Atago and the Musashi and the Yamashiro and the Zuikaku in the same darkness, separated by hundreds of miles of Pacific water, connected by the 4 days in October 1944, when an empire discovered that the war it had been fighting was already over, and the war it was actually losing had been decided long before any of the famous battles took place. David McClintock gave an order. Ernest Evans turned his ship toward battleships. Clifton Sprague ordered his escort carriers to run and fight simultaneously with the resources available. And because those three decisions happened in the same 4 days, Leyte Gulf became what it became. Not a monument to fleets or firepower. A monument to the specific quality of human decision-making under conditions where the correct choice is also the terrifying one. That is why this story is still worth telling. Not for the ships. For the men inside them who did what the moment required, and mostly went home to lives that history never bothered to record. Their names deserve to be remembered, even the ones nobody remembers anymore, especially those